Hello everyone, today we talk about Asiatic light cavalrymen from the 6th to the 11th century AD. So a bit of steppe warfare that we've been intensifying in the last year especially, completely by chance, right, but still, fulfilling our encyclopedical goal here on Schwerpunkt. As these peoples, we have explained it, seen it many times, really contributed dramatically to the development, the same, political and military needs to cope with them, for example, of some major Eurasian civilizations, and they were this looming threat, essentially, of an environment like the steppe one that was naturally different enough from the sedentary areas, from, let's say, having, in fact, established the same difference between sedentary civilizations and this other confederacies existing at their boundaries, but always pressuring them and surely interfering with them, intersecting with them even at some point. This is especially evident, especially in early medieval times, from especially an Eastern European perspective, but also a Middle Eastern one, right? So those regions, from, let's say, a more Western Eurasian perspective, that we document more often, simply because I am located, in fact, in the Western part itself, and I mostly study, these countries' history in general. But that surely, this could be said for the same Chinese, for any major civilization that produced sources at this time in history, which is not a pretty florid one compared to previous or later periods. As you know, there was a broader catalysis of, properly, even at some point, the need of survival, sometimes properly from the attacks of these peoples. But crisis does produce, naturally, a good eye, and even the few sources we have from, at this point, Germans, Scandinavians, Russians, Byzantines, Armenians, Arabs, and the same Chinese, but many others, right? Sometimes from the same peoples, in a way, from their styles, from their, mostly they were literate, as you know, but they also had their own civilization on their scale, are mostly what we get as an outsider perspective. As you understand, the tip of the balance is shifted dramatically from the side of the literate and those who could record this info in contemporary times, right? And so this naturally happened because of direct contact, and the same steps are very diversified. We tend to flatten a little bit the reality of this very broad. As you know, it's mostly a longitudinally developing stripe, literally crosses the whole Eurasia. And that surely has some, characteristics on its own, but also differentiated enough cultures to draw, in fact, certain boundaries. There is not just nomadism in there. This is something that is, somewhat misunderstood about the steppes as well. But largely, there is an homogeneous culture that allows us to describe, in fact, this enormous amount of peoples, a bit according to some standard parameters. And this is the case for today's video, that especially takes into consideration something like costume and armor, right? Maybe not armor, not so much. Today's talking about light cavalry, that, however, was armored its own way, even if, maybe largely not in metal, right? But it would, some biological material that normally the perished, but was described and can offer still kind of valid protection. This look, properly, today we look mostly at this, changed little through this half of a millennium. So, and also some of the tactics, that's not today's video to discuss this, but there was a general evolution of this. We still have to make so much about medieval warfare that never end. However, we can draw this general customary, say, differences a little bit. talking a bit about single factions more than else. You know that these peoples essentially had mostly, as confederacies of tribes, had their own distinctive features, right? In an otherwise, in fact, very homogeneous world. When we talk about light cavalry here, we are referring to a type of arm that performs certain specific duties. That is mostly, especially from this is toward the more Central Asian properly from the core of the populations you observe. That is properly a narrow but quite good elite of heavy cavalry that, as you know, from the steppes pioneered some of the major, even technological changes. I mean, this is the theme of the whole, or roots of chivalry video series, and properly how much this military cultures impacted as we were saying before, the development also of the sedentary ones, including Western chivalry, right, Western knighthood specifically, and that eventually spread. But the majority so this was the shock elite force, mostly attacked as a reserve at the end of the battle, right, hoping to knock out the enemy, was what was left of it with this last major blow, after having fundamentally harassed it with this lighter troops. So you understand that in the steppes, this kind of nullified each other, meaning that the symmetry of it, and this is, greatly true even if you look at clashes between the nomads and the sedentary, generally speaking, asymmetry was very low. So more or less, they counterbalance each other's tactics in a way. So what you have to think in this regard about the typical horse archers or archer or skirmisher of the steppe is that his primary role is actually coping against an enemy that is identical to him, right? So it's literally refined, designed to be exactly that. So when we look from mostly a sedentary perspective, like the one that mostly we cope, we think about the Byzantine military treatises, the strategic and eventually, otherwise elaboration, etc. We get naturally that, the idea that sedentary troops were heavier normally, that they were less mobile than these ones, at least on the field. They were mostly there, pinpointed, if you want, as targets by these missile troopers on horseback that carried out hit-and-run tactics, alternating, all the time in this mentally rather than physically exhausting torment of being targeted by arrows and javelins literally all the freaking time. The amount of arrows we'll see now, even just a simple math, what the single troopers brought on the field at the moment, meaning not even considering the stocks, for the largest armies here could easily surpass or approach the million, plus with the supplies, easily surpass the million arrows to launch in a single day. And you understand, as we've seen also in those videos about Seljuk tactics, etc., that this wasn't it's not that individually these arrows were anything special in terms of penetration of heavier armor, all these things, but because again, remember it, those were designed mostly to cope with softly armored troopers like their own, right? But in this regard, we tend mostly to reduce the nomadic tactics in opposition to the sedentary ones, and getting that stereotype. I always think that we know dramatically less factually or historically. We can hypothesize that, but it would be interesting to have heard the opinion of the directed interest had they written something about it, how warfare was factually against one another, right? We more or less we know that, but it's just that the way they would cope with that, it would be it's the perspective would be interesting, right? Because these were constant whirlwinds of missile troopers always roaming around. There was something also universal in this kind of warfare, properly as a projection of this, the chieftains, the hairy guys, properly standing as men of iron in being fixed, right? And also this swarms of these satellites, right, of the mostly subject peoples, because that's how it functioned most, essentially floated around, were on the field, being spent in that kind of, if you want, confused way, and representing the more, even the less reliable element of the army, if you want, because normally it is, given the lack of organizational structure, of centralized states or something, this, especially the light cavalry, came spontaneously, right? It was, you didn't even have to call them, in a sense, because they would simply join, because every time it was a campaign, they would know, of course, as information traveled as fast as people really wanted at the time. It's a myth that information didn't travel fast. It's just that some people didn't care about that, such as peasants, for example, not to, at least in the moment of their own immediate needs, under the lords that managed the situation. But also these people knew everything. They would join just for the loot, and that's what they were in. So factually, it's also a vision of power. That is to say, every time you lift your hand as a head of command, you knew that somebody was there, seeing that news would spread, that you would immediately have this dramatic manpower, naturally as powerful as you were. And that was the problem, mostly because these confederacies were also, and that's why their history is complicated, sometimes also their ethnogenesis, as you understand, and that's why there was so much homogeneity, after all, paradoxically, among them, would cause dramatic political fluctuations here and there. So one could look at the Avar appearance as characteristic, if you want, of nearly all steppes peoples. The Avars are somewhat well documented, given that they occupied the Pannonian Basin, and this was, that brought in attrition with the Byzantines, with the Franks, etc. So we have an idea of more or less what they were. There was a problem of, naturally also, the settlement is well documented enough to understand who they were and what they looked like, right? Eventually they merged with the local population, but the point is exactly this, that as they looked, also lots of other peoples looked, so much that in fact in Balkan archaeology sometimes we can't tell whether they were Avars or Bulgars, whatever, but that's the point, right? It's not important, right? Even though if there are people who would kill each other's mothers in order to to prove the fact that oh my God, that was that or that. It's a non-problem historically, largely, especially in terms of properly of look and appearance, as in warfare, and especially in the steppes, everything was so hybrid, right? That, and it still is today, frankly, that at some point it doesn't even matter. Right, look what the Taliban's with U.S. equipment. Well, it's not just an accident. That is what you can see, in the market of weapons, in spite of this specific example everywhere. Right, it doesn't even make any sense to try to distinguish, even though there are some channels, there are some logic, certain dynamics, but warfare is not even properly made by that. Contrarily to what technologistic bias actually presumes. Others were famous. We're making some stereotypes here in the base of the sources. They would have dirty black hair, shaved high on the scalp, right, with one long lock plated with colored ribbons and held by gold clasps, right? So for the rest, they were practically bald, right, and having just this long lock, and with this clasp, etc. And one source says that the Avars had learned their name. In fact, probably much in the same way that's been suggested, inaccurately though, that the Khazars may have taken their name from Russian koza, meaning pigtail, right? So they're talking about two tresses, one at each ear, also added sometimes. These had to do with the various identities the various groups had, right, various subgroups, because that's something you can't see that clearly, right? And that tells you also, in a way, how headgear wasn't quite there, especially for this light cavalryman to be recognized. The fact that they were shaped bald, except for this tresses, is also tells you how it's something fairly visible, right? In even on the distance. But so that's important because aside from big battles where things wouldn't necessarily be more orderly than in other situations, still you have to think of all these small bands roaming around in the steppe without any other mean of identification but such things, and maybe surely something about their clothing, their other even fighting styles, some equipment, maybe decorations or things like that, rather than, as we were saying before, something essentially different in a functional sense. And the shaved head specifically was characteristic of most of the Turkic peoples of Central Asia, which the Avars fit, right? Independently from what this ethnically meant, because all these peoples were mixed. This early medieval times see essentially the prevalence of the Turks over the Indo-Europeans, over the Iranians that had dominated the steppe since the ancient world, and the Turks take over. So there is a lot of, as overlords, surely they managed to oust most of the Iranians, not really all, from the Western Eurasian steppe as rulers, in fact. But they are factually mixed because, of course, the peoples who were there before remained there, right? And in spite of massacres and other plain butchery that happen all the time, there's still manpower in the steppe is fundamental. So as we were saying before, the more powerful you are, and the more you have these people simply flocking to you and providing you with their service independently from your, also because they knew they would have been taken out, or at least it would have not been convenient for them to engage in warfare. So given the constant instability, still this was okay. At some point things will change. Of course, certain peoples completely lost their identity, or they at least were absorbed later on. This is also a bit the history of the steppes in general. We're making recently the video on the old Bulgaria, for example, how it split, and how some groups, some went in the Balkans to form on Bulgaria, the empire. Others went were to become the Volga Bulgars. Others remained where they were. Others were settled by the Longobards in central Italy. They were used to properly from the way they were put together as peoples, right, in very general fashion, right, could decompose as they had just recomposed, and not really, sometimes not even leaving a concrete trace, because again, the also material culture, archaeology cannot answer those questions, or I mean, it can draw certain approximations, but material culture is so homogeneous that even when something new is introduced, you can't really understand what's wood there, right? Archaeological finds do not have tags telling us. It's just like for, the Germanic peoples during the migration era. I mean, we know from historiographical sources that they more or less went across certain paths, but for what we can archaeologically see, there is just a big pool of indistinguishable archaeological material that doesn't tell us literally anything about who was who there, because they were all alike. They tell us, of course, what kind of culture they were, what was their level of development, or all such things, but fundamentally, without historiographical sources, you really can't make history with material evidence alone. At least in the overwhelming majority of quantitative positive information that we have about history, like historiography, is overwhelmingly more important in that regard. And so it was normal to shave off the beard as well among the Turks, what little most of them could grow, and the Magyars that were not Turks, but Ugrophanes with, however, Turkic and Iranian elements as well, at least often scarred their own faces like the earlier Huns did, and even some Slavs as a consequence, especially the ones that were, guided during the invasions of these peoples. Went alongside them, and this was some people say it's because not they would do it on purpose for the beard thing, but this was possibly part of some specific rites, maybe certain funerary ones, but not only. Probably there is more to it, and in any case, it was a big deal, right? Because you don't scar your face just for the sake of it, right? There was some political, religious, and military meaning alike, which of course mean substantially the same thing from all perspectives, and it was just a way of recognizing. In there, you can't see under the sun, a scalp, a face, right? The human skin reflects sun, etc. These peoples were, generally speaking, light skinned, aside from certain ones. I mean, we're talking about color proper, and that is, you wouldn't surprise, an important indicator. So if we were to speak of a typical costume of the Asiatic light cavalryman, we would think of a long, loose under tunic, split at front and back, right? So for naturally not creating problems when they went on horseback and having, right, this rope essentially cumulating in the front or in the rear, just going the two sides. Then a kaftan, a short over tunic, trousers, boots, as cavalrymen, of course, and occasionally a cloak as well. So these men were, by the way, used to the most radically violent form of physical discomfort than you can imagine. These people literally lived on horseback, right? Sources went on joking of the Huns that back in the day that they couldn't even walk straight because they were literally just always on horseback, and it had become unnatural. That's an exaggeration, but it means a lot, because for these people, the entire, you see, it's all about the metus hostilis and how cohes were in the steppe in the absence of some permanent, sedentary structure. So they were always under threat. Their whole mythology, worldview, culture gravitated around the fact that if you couldn't fight and you weren't always fit for it, that you couldn't even hope to dream to survive in that world. So, of course, it was not enough, but that's exactly the point. You have to be at least ready for at least fighting back if there is something that goes wrong in this sense. So, being under the weather for these people was like a joke, right? They had dramatically brutal and short lives. This is true. But also they had a physical endurance that, in this regard, in the range of those, decades of existence, could allow them to get used basically to everything, in terms of what you can imagine being a horseman is often moving, being always on the move, independently from, because some people stayed where they were, but maybe the men or some of them actually went out, reaching, and some were properly sent out because they couldn't be supported, couldn't be fed. Others, so that there were, we can't see all that mobility even in sedentary Europe with mercenarism and all, even in early medieval times. You can imagine in the steppe, right? Going across thousands of kilometers was a joke for these guys. As dangerous as could, they lived on horseback. Yes. So you understand also this outfit was particularly refined and functional to millennia of steppes culture, right? So if you want to know what would have been the best at the time, that would have been the best. You look at them and there's a standard thing, this is the deal. So the materials of clothing included silk brocade for some, the steppes culture was quite radically obsessed with wealth, because of course they hardly saw any, and their whole deal was about looting the richer, and that visibility we were talking about before, that publicity, that open political reality, was also about, the more expensive stuff you wear, And the more this proves that you're somewhat a successful warrior, and therefore people should follow you, right? So silk brocade was a big deal. It also had some defensive function. You know that silk is used still today in bulletproof jackets. It was done, it was used in other cultures. If you think about the Japanese, I don't remember what the kind of airbag they had in the back when they retreated from archery fire. Archer shot, with filled with wind would provide that kind of resistance. But there was probably an aesthetical and therefore a political and propaganda purpose to that. You can imagine also, this is expensive things would last with limited amount of time, relatively amount of time. Dyed leather, that would be a very common thing. Colors, we know, at least the Byzantine mercenaries, properly this Asian cavalrymen that poured en masse in Byzantine armies were provided by the state some of the properly the leather, right, already colored. So scarlet, red, purple we get from this source as kind of colors, and furs as well. So here the steps that we were saying before, there are very different environments and climates depending also on the surrounding areas as well and trade. So typically sable, ermine, fox, stoat, gray squirrel, even wolf, bear skin. And the steppes were also kind of a trade highway, as you know, so that you could find something more exotic, such as leopard or monkey fur, which naturally came from far away. Also wool, given that these were shepherds at large, they moved with their cattle and so other animals and so on, so that to get leather, etc. And boots, as we were saying before, boots are central. They were made of felt and or leather, right? And they had soft soles because this could provide a tighter grip to the stirrup, right, while they were pressing the foot, squeezing the boot between, and you know that this guy's legs muscles were something dramatically tough, right? You can imagine of steel, as if you fight on horseback all the time, and these people were capable of the most incredible stunts on horseback. They had to direct the animal, the thing they had went on tough terrain. They had all the kind of equestrian expertise you can imagine, and they therefore cared very much about the grip on the stirrup, that at this point, as you know, was in the steppe out there from quite a while. And we have some evidence from also manuscripts, such as a late 9th century Byzantine illumination, with some slight difference. In this case, for example, there is a baggy shirt and a wide flowing trousers that probably are influenced by the long Arab-style topcoat that in this case was split for riding. This time was the heyday of Islamic civilization, so the north of the Middle East, etc. These steppe peoples also harassed the caliphate as much as they harassed the Byzantines and other empires, and so they would get significantly influenced by that. Also considering that the caliphate, like the Middle East altogether, was you can say necessarily more open to these people's penetration, but as you know, the Ghulams, these other mercenaries that would eventually take over and even changing the caliphal policy and bring into divisions, etc. The Byzantine Empire would remain more compact, in spite even in their rise of like the Varangians, like a bit Praetorians, and deposing emperors sometimes, but not quite demolishing the state, nor really having this huge interference in the political division of Europe, right? Instead, as it would be in the Islamic world, as you know that the Caliphate, yes, the Muslims conquered everything, like from the Atlantic to China, at some point, but they immediately fragmented. So this was part of the reason why that world was, if you want, in that moment of prosperity, more permeable to these mercenaries, because wherever you find political division and a lot of money, you find somebody else infiltrating dramatically easy. So this Islamic fashion, if you want, influence on Asian light cavalry is thus explained. And always from the same source, we see long hair, right? And this probably means that the guy was a Pechenek/Patzinak, who in addition sported also impressive beards and mustaches. Clothes were of gabardine, except the nobility wore silk, usually. And a bit characteristic of the Pecheneks are also the pointed fur felt caps, right? And they were usually black, so much that there is some, ethnonym maybe deriving from this, the black hats, the white hats, these things over, but that's another thing, and there is a lot of mix. Also because, sadly enough, these peoples went, they kind of exist, like sometimes in the steppes, in spite of all that instability, you find still a strong identities in spite of new groups joining and that remain at the core of the confederacies. And some of these peoples lived very long, right before essentially the Russians conquered Siberia, the Eurasian steppes in the Western Eurasian steppe in the modern age. When they were conquered, were still illiterate largely, right? So, and they wouldn't quite have historiography as we intended. So we even when these peoples live on, even just biologically in many of Central Asian countries, but we don't quite know much about who they are, because they themselves kind of lived on some legends and mythology that they don't quite, like, we understand some of the modern identities are somewhat very different from, even if a name survives or an ethnonym survives specifically, it's not really what it was at the time. So we have difficulties even to understand who was who, where they descend from. And this is the puzzle of the steppe that cannot quite ever be fully recomposed historically. Sources also record the Khazars as having long flowing hair that are described as both reddish and black. And one part of the Khazars is said to have been dark-skinned as Indians by the sources. So this is interesting because you see, it's what we were saying before. I mean, these confederacies were quite mixed historically, right? Here we have reddish color that could be, some kind of Iranian descent, Indo-European descent, and more because you don't have to underestimate in this sense. The slaves, for example, they would pick in some other areas like the Slavic world that was always, kind of developing even in response against these raids or things like that, as later on would be. But also, as we were saying, all those pre-existing Indo-European populations had been absorbed. The fact that some part of the Khazars would be dark-skinned as Indians is also like, well, how dark as Indians, India is, also quite varied in that regard. So we don't know what they meant. But surely they were darker than the others. There was a block of them that was considered as different, right? One part. So it's not just you pick some 10 random Khazars and they are more or less different in color, right? Like you could pick in a modern nation, more or less, you can't track anymore the ethnic background at some levels. Here it's just literally a part of them evidently had a pregress identity that had remained somewhat detached in spite of all, also biologically, genetically from the others for some time. Speaking of armament, at this point the saber was pretty widespread in the steppe. There is a gradual change that in very approximate terms in the western steppes brought to essentially from straight swords, but just, these longer ones, not like the Akinakas or these kind of daggers, etc., but properly the swords that were typical of this broader. You find them in among the Sarmatians, even the Scythians, but also the Sassanids, and they're a bit from the same ones that we got in West, like the Celtic metallurgy, the Sparta, etc., that the Romans and the Germans eventually take. It's essentially of the same type, right? I have an hypothesis. I'm no expert about this, but in my opinion, the new waves of Turks may have brought to different political and social models that were somewhat more advanced, in the sense that, collectively speaking, they had a greater control, and they brought also this new mass. They were a demographic force, right? So the idea is that the Sabre requires actually an easier training than the straight blade sword, and we know that Central Asian warfare, as we were saying before, is stereotypically just the ultra elite and all these swarms of people. So these swarms of people that we're documenting now were probably much less trained in terms of sword, right? And then in proportion, peoples like the Sarmatians or the Scythians would have been. Difference is not dramatic, but you have to logically explain why this shift happened. So this is kind of a primitive explanation, but I think there is something to it. And so Sabre here is curved one-edged cutting sword, right? So generally you replace the straight one around 700 AD, right? And then of course the bow, which were actually brought in multiple numbers, just 2 or 3 often could be carried. Plus, you can imagine strings, etc. Quivers could contain up to 60 arrows, but on average, probably 24 to 30 arrows were usually carried, right? As this, as we were saying before, brings, however, the missile potential of the largest armies is something incredible, right? Given that these guys were the overwhelming numerical majority of the army, and this had counted in the range of tens of thousands, we're talking easily about something approximating to 1 million, right? So think of what it means, right? Even let's leave aside the devastating psychological effect that is. It's as if you're fighting under the rain, but properly even think about, for these peoples, what the broader production of the projectiles was about. I mean, how important. But naturally, most of these horsemen were able to produce, easily, virtually all of them, to literally create all their equipment from scratch, in a sense. Maybe except the sabers, but they had some capacity of doing it. At least it was common enough, at least, to find them around. Naturally, there would be somebody else that was a more infrastructurally developed production system. But as far as bows, arrows, these guys were able to live out there in the wilderness for months or years, or what is the wilderness in here? I mean, some of them would literally live in it their entire lives. So in any case, they had to get the stuff. Also because it's not just for military purpose, but also for hunting, right? For eating, literally. And they were mostly about these things, given that they had a few sedentarism. And after all, a man is just like another animal. So these arrows were light, right? So they had a somewhat limited penetration, as we were saying before. It was not really important. First of all, because most people's horses were devoid of armor, right? Yes, padded coating was more common than we think, probably, but it seems clear that, and surely that can make miracles against arrows, but it's not really... we know that horses regularly, even in much heavier warfare, much more metal-loaded warfare, were the ones suffering the most from missile fire and dying. And so you can imagine in the steppes where basically there was no armor, no metal armor, if not in the ultra-elite. Or very small ones, it was not covering the whole horse by any stretch of the imagination as the regular thing that would, in any single culture, that if it existed consistently, which it did at some point, but it was minimal, right? Even in Western warfare, we don't get, I think, realistically more than 1/10 of horses covered in mail just by the late 13th century. But there is some debate about this because sources are not entirely clear. We don't have many archaeological finds, and iconographic sources do not really make us understand whether something is like leather or mail. That's not really thing, or padded coating or whatever. But surely in the steppe, as we were saying before, these arrows were mostly designed to penetrate soft targets, or the softer ones, and they were enough for that. But again, against a static enemy, you have to imagine this nomads were saying, wow, finally, a fixed target. Like in the steppe, the whole thing was probably, here they were excellent marksmen in this regard. I mean, naturally in battle, they would, battle missile employment is completely different from the one of, I don't know, precision fire, especially in the distance. It's about the number of volleys and their frequency, their order, the way they're carried out. Probably these peoples had something relatively less orderly, as on any battlefield gets out of the window as things get heated, right? But given that they were somewhat, the broader collective training wasn't that. At least they knew how to move in herds, right? And were on the battlefield and alternating also in the small unit tactics, this fire, etc. It was mostly a continuous thing. It was mostly about the various pirouettes and kind of caracal they carried out, the Cantabrian circle, whatever you want to call it in that sense, in ways that were naturally very fluid and depending on the situations. That was their main deal, also being able to adapt to any terrain. So that tells you how disorderly in a sense it was. But you become a good sharpshooter, if anything, exactly for this, because you're used to throw at somebody to shoot at somebody that is always on the move. So it would be dramatically easy at some point to target, a Byzantine infantry or Caliphal infantry formation that were just sitting there, right, covered in shields and armor, etc., to just receive those hits and have a relatively small effect, but that was still, however, a big deal when you're under the sun, under incessant fire. You can't really relieve the formation. Somebody does get hurt and killed, and so it's psychologically devastating just being hammered over and over again for days. Maybe imagine without water, in all the appalling conditions. That, by the way, these guys, we've seen it when commenting the Avar and Magyar tactics from the Strategicon and Little Wise, that they were absolutely skilled in cutting you off from any kind of supply of source, of especially water, etc. So that's what effectively, all this fire, it doesn't matter whether it's really physically impacting. The important is how much it adds to a broader frustration and mental exhaustion that at some point you break. Right, it's very psychological in nature, and there is something also probably scenographic in all this, being that you really see these guys all there. You don't understand, because you don't understand whether the worst is coming, because they knew that there was heavy cavalry waiting, and these fights could go on for days. We've seen it even at the Battle of Manzikert, that it started with the Byzantines not even realizing that the Seljuks had brought in the whole army. It was just so these swarms of horse archers roaming around, harassing them, and nothing really happening. That's really unnerving, right? And exhausting. And the arrows were usually carried point uppermost, by the way, and then there were often, this is kind of underappreciated, I guess, about steppes warfare, javelins, right? Light, hollow javelins, usually in a case suspend from the saddle, right? Javelins are, more useful at closer range, especially against heavier armor, in a sense, and it also partly reflects this need that the majority of warriors historically, especially at this point still, even in sedentary areas, had to have some kind of throwing weapon, even as infantry, as stopping force, etc. Because it can really be useful in so many circumstances, also in sieges. I studied these things even for very late on. Like we often underestimate how still, I don't know, by the 14th century that I studied the most, the majority of stuff that were actually thrown from from castles over the assailants were stones. Something as primitive but yet so effective as stones. The same goes by javelins. They were quite often more lethal in a sense, especially in the junctures of the armor, than crossbow bolts. Albeit, those also claimed a lot of victims, really, and especially among the elite. So that these were armor strikers in a sense. Javelins can come in handy at every moment. Just also you can't do like with the bow. You have to use two hands at the same time. Javelins, just one is enough, so you can have a bit more flexibility, especially at closer range when things can get heated or even much more close hand-to-hand combat. A javelin can be more useful in a way. It depends on the situation, naturally. And so that's an additional kind of force, and it can be used also. Like the impression is that these guys went, and the more they sedentarized, in a sense, the more they abandoned archery in favors of javelins. This is a broader process that is not much to be seen in the Middle Ages, because after all, infantry weapons like bows and crossbows at some point in this frontier areas, especially in Eastern Europe with the Slavs, etc., were kind of compensating for that. But if you, I don't know, think about the Scythians and the Sarmatians. Like, the idea is that by the Scythians were taking over, they were somewhat more already softened up, more gentrified, and they were more similar to the local sedentary neighbors. And incidentally, we find much more javelins in that kind of warfare than, I don't know, the Alans in the eastern part of, the Sarmatians that were probably coming from Central Asia at that point, straight, and were much more about archery and other kind of, even the famous, at that point there was even a combination between properly the Contus and the archer, and the bow in the same guy, right? Whereas, say, I don't know, among the Sasanians, among the Persians in general, you see from the Parthian to Sasanian times that the figure of the cataphract / archer fundamentally gets split in either the heavier cavalry, that it's not even cataphract anymore because it's too much, it's too heavy, and it can interact with other infantry, which in the steppe normally you don't find, and the archer is another thing, right? Whereas those guys that came straight from the hardcore Central Asian meat grinder were somewhat so psychologically pressured that they could, at least in the elite, perform both. This has nothing to do with the light cavalry we're documented today, but it's just to tell you how this level of pressure could be paralleled in the archer performance. So something that we can hardly understand, maybe. But at that point, it's more important, as always, collective training, which this is something more complicated to get, right? This is what, as far as we understand, they were not like they didn't have the order of the later Mongols in a sense, but still were close enough. So probably there was some kind of important organized performance, especially for the greater empires, the Western, the Turkish, and it depends. It's just we don't have enough sources about it. Lassos are another thing that these chattel owners would know how to use and to adapt in combat to entangle enemy riders and horses in close combat. This is really overestimated in effectiveness, meaning that not only there is evidence, of course, of this thing being ridiculous. Like there are some. There's a lot of naturally, even here, technologism involved, and people properly don't understand. They see their favorite people. They say, they used lassos. They were so cool. They used them to tie down, to entangle enemy riders. Yet this mostly happened in situations where you could afford to do it. Meaning by normally encircling the enemy or in a situation where you really don't have to worry about what is happening around. So normally, in collective formation, lassos are completely useless. And of course, if you don't maintain a cohesive formation that is able to countercharge an enemy charge and maintain cohesion, etc., you're completely slaughtered without any hope. So lassos, my eyes, right? But let's say that there are some famous, episodes where, yes, in certain battles, say especially at the end, the heavier troopers were structured in this way. But we're talking still about tactical situations, which you can easily imagine the ratios of force involved there, like some exhausted heavy cavalrymen that were at some point giving up, also because surrounded by the numbers of these guys would easily entangle them. But that's not a normal tactical situation, right? This happened mostly at the end when there were also the enemies were being chased, etc. And it's not much different from there's no qualitative military culture behind the idea of you know how to use lassos in battle. It was mostly, I think, an extremization of that steps idea that no resource had to go wasted, right? So maybe capturing an enemy alive rather than simply cutting him down, which would not normally happen anyway, may have done, right, being done, as slavery was basically what all these societies were founded on, and they capturing an enemy alive could be a thing, especially if he was a dangerous, heavier horseman that wouldn't give up, right? Considered that even in their own society specifically. So that was a big prey. But for the rest, there is even some later sources about steppe warfare, even in the modern age, that documents an incredible amount of times how lasso stereotypically, right? There were some people who were boasting the fact that they used lassos and others wouldn't, and there's actually more evidence, of course, of the fact that lassos were not much used, and that certain stereotype in a broader military sense, right? And that the certain military stereotype passed through the idea that those with lassos were actually cut down by those without, even though that's yet another approximation, meaning that, of course, there was no people who attacked just with lassos, right? So that was just saying, those guys, that's the best they could use, right? And still trying to mock others like normal thieves and not as true warriors, right? And that's factually true, because the military effectiveness of these armies was had absolutely nothing to do with having lassos or bow. Right, so you have to be extremely clear about this. There is some, stereotyping about the Magyars and the Pechenegs having made a greater use of axes. Right, in the Magyars you see came as Ugro-Finnic peoples from probably more like not much the steppes area, but the forest one. So maybe that's part of the reason why they had more axes stereotypically. About the Pechenegs, I wouldn't know, but surely there is one thing in warfare that wherever you find an axe, there is a traumatic weapon of sort. There is some armor, right, to break. Right, this is not entirely true. I mean, if you look at Scandinavian warfare, you see that axes were quite common, but in a sense, there it's difficult to give a comprehensive explanation. Part of it might have been that, because people said, because Vikings, Scandinavians were poor at the time, they would compensate, with axes for sword. Well, the swords, contrarily to what many people believe from modern testing, were actually designed, I mean, in the broader history of technology, to actually break armor. They weren't really cutting through it like butter, but for sure. But actually, you see it easily, and the way swords were becoming sharper and sharper and sharper up to the 14th century, when they changed radically. We had to be mostly about from cutting to thrusting fundamentally, and that's obviously because of the armor changing. So yes, that makes it indirectly a proof that it was designed to deliver the specific center of gravity of the tip, that blow, to break armor, and they would break armor, right? They weren't just, it's not by breaking armor even here that you solve wars or battles or combat, but still they could do something about that. Axes are designed, if you want, in a more traumatic sense, so it is possible that there is a conjunction, but the idea is that if a culture has to fight against armor, but chances are in this world that they can produce armor themselves, and if they can't produce armor themselves, they can produce sword themselves. So it really doesn't explain the thing. It might have simply been that the axe was still an effective traumatic weapon, like there would actually exist in other circumstances, and maybe the Magyars were maybe as in origin slightly less nomadic in nature. They had more hand fighting than others, or maybe it was an environmental reason. They simply lived in more forested areas. They had to survive in using axes more frequently in a way. So this all add together as a bit of a stereotype, but axes were common for that matter also among other Asiatic peoples. So there were also basically among all these peoples small circular shields of leather or interwoven osiers, at least among the light cavalry. For the rest, there would be something more resistant. That is it's a bit standard in the steppe at that point, and you understand it's a limited protection, right? There is not paradoxically you would say why, right? You would think these guys needed more more protection given all the arrow fire. This is not entirely true. Of course, every time you add a weight, you have to compensate in something else, mostly in fact, not just speed, but properly yes, in part also speed properly, because you don't want to exhaust yourself before for the additional weight. I know that shields in general may not be that weight, but you would be surprised how much difference that can make, especially in combat. What these guys mostly relied on was on speed, right? And speed not just in sense of horse speed, but properly the speed in their own movements on horseback. That is to say, rather than protecting themselves at some levels, they would mostly think about being faster and shooting faster. And that altogether made the broader difference. And the reason why we don't quite understand that is, of course, that normally we ignore completely the collective dimension. That is to say, if they are all speedier, better archers, etc., you don't even need to be targeted because you essentially shoot the enemy in a way, and you get less losses than at that collective level than simply having a larger shield and pretending that that's enough for not being taken down. That's silly. Your horse will be taken down in the first place, and you can't cover your horse in shield or armor, as we've seen. They didn't have resources, so the quickest thing is to make it quicker, right? And therefore suffering less losses, otherwise not engaging at all. So at that point, having a larger shield is useless, right? Especially with this great deal of mobility. In other contexts, it's different, right? So, but in the steppes, it's kind of obvious that it would function like this. And naturally, the small shield also in close combat would provide you some kind of, capacity of deflecting blows, or, being a bit more, offensive and defensive. I mean, not through the shield, but through the effect of the shield in the broader synergy of combat. And yeah, there is a picture from the Minologion of Basil II, and inserted also here. At some point we see that Byzantine saints being massacred by the Bulgars. So at this point it would be the Bulgarians, the Danubian ones. The illumination is from 1017, so we are at the time, in fact, of Basil II, where the Bulgarians, not only the Bulgars now were Bulgarians, but they were also quite Romanized. But they had this typical dress, right? That another Byzantine source records the Bulgars having adopted from the Avars, while the Holy Roman Imperial Ambassador Liutprand of Cremona, who went to Constantinople, records a 10th century Bulgar nobleman with a bronze chain belt and a Magyar-style haircut as well. So a lot of hybrids still. These coats, as you know, would also be designed to protect, to isolate thermically from brutal excursions, temperature excursions, especially in the steppes, but in general, in any other context. And that, so this idea of haircut, etc., survived well until the 11th century, even in a place like the Balkans in a sedentary situation. And so you can imagine in the steppe. And in the picture, the guy also carries a board rather than a saber, though, so that's another proof of hybrid, and how, of course, dress is not related largely to how you're gonna fight necessarily, nor weapons themselves, telling the truth, because they can be combined in different ways and used in different ways. An important part in this scenario is also covered by the Finnish tribes. They are somewhat overlooked. And we have the image of a burta, and wearing a Persian kula headgear, right, with a turban wrapped around. Typically, he would be equipped even here with a bow, with 2 javelins, the high circular shield, and a few body armor. That is a thing that we have to understand, and under the light of the fact many peoples, independently from how stratified they were maybe not in this sense, but that in very poor areas, even what we would call elite, like a heavy trooper, may have not even had armor. Right? It's a bit what we were saying before with the bow and protection of the shield, meaning that maybe in that kind of warfare, being armed in a way was better than being protected, a bit more offensive than defensive in this sense. So they had horses. The upper classes fought among the Finnish tribes on horseback as well, but they wouldn't necessarily be so wealthy to afford an actual metal body armor. Some would, naturally, but it's just we see that the numbers are apparently lower. The Finns also would wear an ear ring, only from one side, as it's the case still among many modern Central Asian nomads. And clothing among these peoples was mostly of reindeer and stoat, and worn hairy side out, which would be more effective to isolate. Albeit the author Marvadzi records that the Juris, that is in fact another Finnish tribe, wore sable in other force as well. And the reindeer jerkin in itself may have properly provided as some form of armor, right? Tanned, hides, things were thick enough to provide some kind of protection, right? Not all blows come straight or with all full force, so that sometimes that's enough, right? And always think as in war, you don't have to have the top thing, right? First of all, it doesn't consider the doctrine, right? First of all, top for what, actually? But secondly, in warfare, what mostly works is what is good enough, right? Even when your life is at stake, because again, war is about collective interaction, right? So the individual passes in second order, right? Even among populations that seem kind of relying more individualistically on the single warrior, but war is factually not about that. We have to get rid of this bias as soon as possible, because as long as we have it, it means that properly we don't understand the ABC of warfare, right? It's always about the collective training. The more you rely on individual in warfare, and the more you declare your military inferiority. Always remember this. And we know that the Bashkirs, for example, were very similar to the Volga Bulgars, who were very similar from some surrounding peoples, and they shaved their heads and wore boots. And in a way, it was very difficult to distinguish them from Arabs in basic dress, given that they wore trousers, long top coats, and turbans. This is fascinating because the Volga Bulgars, just because of their location, were quite open, naturally, to the Middle East trade and so on. But even here, it's not because they actually wore Arab. It's just that clothes at the time were somewhat similar and practically functional for similar environments. Tattoos were also a thing, right? the Turks kept using them, but they were known since Scythian times, right? And they resembled very much, in fact, the latter ones, as they're documented up to the 10th century. Michael Psellus records the Scyths, so here this kind of a classicistic ethnographic term of these peoples living north of the in the steppes, basically. But probably these were Pechenegs at the time, because it was the most common by the mid 11th century, where the source wrote. Well, these peoples would paint themselves, right? So it was absolutely common still at the time to have this. And naturally, you know what the meaning is. Tattoos were here yet another mark of identity. They were thought to have some kind of apotropic function to call on the divinity, strength, and protection in battle. And even this is all the more, it's indicative of primitive military cultures that have to, rather than wearing an armor that could definitely be way more effective than a tattoo. From a mechanical point of view, they have to cope with this constant threat to the caducity of their own lives, and therefore they have to indoctrinate themselves, mentally speaking, through this symbolism. Otherwise, they can't quite cope with reality. I would say this is a bit anthropologically speaking what tattoos have always spread in a sense for. I mean, there must be some deeper reason, not just a simple identitary one, but a story of pressure, a story of some need of some even desperate one at some point to be using it, or some situation that evidently needs that yet additional thing to cope with life, right? And never underestimate this aspect as well. Alright, so for today we stop it here. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.